So much of the mainstream talk of the past month has been about Minnesota and ICE. You didn't hear much about the dozens killed in winter storms, or the thousands of protesters killed in Iran, or the fraud happening in the exact same place. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about it here because there's already a million different opinions out there. But now that we seem to be over the peak in conflict, I want to go back and reflect on a few different things about the situation and why it didn't have to be the way it was. And multiple things can be true at once. I may not be a huge fan of things like law enforcement wearing multicam tactical gear and masks, but I get why crazy people doxing them and their families force them to do it. I certainly think ICE agents can make mistakes and be unnecessarily aggressive, and should be held accountable when that happens, but increasing the likelihood of mistakes and split-second decisions by actively or passively resisting and obstructing lawful law enforcement, just because you don't like the laws that they're enforcing, certainly isn't going to help the problem. Local authorities preventing local law enforcement from mitigating the tensions doesn't help either. If Minneapolis Police Department had always operated like they are now, 2 people would probably still be alive. And many people on the outside are letting their emotional response to those 2 difficult encounters control their opinions more than actual broad rationality. So before getting into more popular talking points, let's clarify a few things in regards to federal law enforcement and the citizens' ability to push back on them. ICE, or Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, is obviously the federal law enforcement agency that focuses on immigration law, and people all over the place are claiming that they're acting unlawfully or they can't do the things that they're doing. But just because they focus on immigration law doesn't mean they can't enforce all federal law if a violation occurs in their vicinity under Title 18, which includes Chapter 73, Obstruction of Justice, particularly the first section, 1501, Assault on a Process Server, which covers obstructing, resisting, opposing, or assaulting any officer executing a legal process. People wonder why ICE have arrested Americans, and that's probably why. Assault, by definition, is more than just physical strikes. To cover all our bases, for those that don't know, the U.S. code that covers unlawful entry into the U.S. is 8 U.S. Code 1325, saying anyone who enters or attempts to enter the United States at any time or place other than as designated by immigration officers, eludes examination or inspection by immigration officers, or attempts to enter or obtain entry into the United States by willfully false or misleading representation is in violation of the law. And the preceding code, 1324, covers harboring certain aliens, saying that anyone who knowingly or in reckless disregard conceals, harbors, or shields from detection those who do not have authorization to come to, enter, or reside in the United States are in violation of this code. This includes anyone who engages in conspiracy to commit these acts, or anyone who aids and abets them. So blowing whistles to let illegal immigrants know where ICE agents are in order to avoid them could theoretically be counted even though nobody has been arrested specifically for that. Technically, unlawful entry is a civil offense, but you can be detained for civil offenses. If there's a need to compel an individual to appear before court or enforce a court order, in many of these cases a deportation order, law enforcement has the right to detain you. And in a perfect world with perfect people, the government could just notify people here illegally that their time is up, that they need to leave, and they would. But we don't live in a perfect world. And many of the people who are not authorized to be here are not going to leave just because they get a piece of paper in the mail. If they would, they probably wouldn't have jumped the immigration line to come here or stay here without authorization in the first place. So those are the statutes granting federal enforcement agencies like ICE the authority to conduct immigration arrests and arrest those who obstruct them. And if you don't like those laws, then vote. Vote for people who want to change them. But citizens in a democratic system have zero authority to go out and stop law enforcement from enforcing the democratically implemented laws on the books. That would be anarchy, mob rule, or could even legitimately be called an insurrection if it's coordinated, maybe via a signal chat allegedly involving democratic officials. Now, people absolutely have the right to protest, and they have the right to record law enforcement doing their job. No problem there. But nobody has a right to obstruct or harass. We still have a legal system, which generally does still work. If you see law enforcement at any level, local, county, state, or federal, acting improperly, you can take them to court. That's the beauty of checks and balances. And as long as we still have a representative government and a means to change laws, you can't really say you're justified to stop authorities from executing the laws democratically elected representatives implement. And law enforcement cannot fold to the mob. The mob cannot dictate what laws can and cannot be enforced. That sets a very dangerous precedent. ICE is not the Gestapo. This is not like Anne Frank. We don't live in 1930s Germany. Voters voted for immigration enforcement. It was one of the main issues of the 2024 election, and you could bet there'd be a million lawsuits if this was not a legal act. Now, I'll admit some of the administration's actions, like sending people to El Salvador or CICOT for crimes they committed here, is not ideal. If an illegal immigrant commits a crime here, they should serve their sentence here or just get deported to their country of origin. And the memo that said agents could enter her home with an administrative warrant instead of a judicial is on very questionable legal grounds and I think should be avoided as well. And there are other things causing outrage that have been legal but optically poor. And sometimes that's hard to defend, but intentionally provocative media coverage encouraging idiots who think they're Captain America fighting Nazis doesn't help. People vote to enforce immigration law, but they don't want to see federal agents getting into scuffles with citizens, which is fine for most parts of the country that ICE is operating in that isn't allowing mass obstruction, just not Minneapolis. Now that that has been said, why haven't we seen ICE look as aggressive in other places? They're operating all over the country. So is it just that these agents being sent to Minneapolis specifically are more aggressive than other agents currently operating throughout the country? Or maybe is it that they're reacting to a much more hostile and obstructive population that has been egged on by their own leadership? Do you think we would see the violent clashes and shootings if people were actually peacefully protesting and recording without getting in the way of legitimate law enforcement operations? I think judging by the fact that ICE has arrested more people in places like Texas and Florida without significant news surrounding them would be an obvious no to that question. A big factor being local law enforcement cooperation, or lack thereof. ICE agents are not meant to suppress riots. If local PD was always there like they seem to be now, to create a buffer between protesters and ICE, not only would you see violent interactions drop, but you would also have a third party there to hold everyone accountable. That brings us to the main point of contention and polarization, ICE-involved shootings. And look, I don't want to see anyone get killed. It's not good for anyone. There are three things to consider though. One is that these are very isolated incidents. ICE has over 22,000 agents that interact with hundreds or thousands of people every day, with hundreds of thousands of total arrests, and 99% of those interactions are perfectly fine, especially outside of Minneapolis. The second is that you can't take one or two bad interactions and condemn the whole group or organization. That's just intellectual laziness. And third, let's be honest, you can't inject yourself into a violent confrontation with police, carrying a gun or wielding a vehicle, and expect the interaction to go very well. And this is where so many internet armchair experts forensically analyzing a slow motion video through a 4-inch phone screen annoy me. When it comes to Renee Good, what matters at the end of the day is did the agent have a legitimate reason to believe his life was in danger? Her intentions mean nothing. She could have been a nice person, but psychoanalyzing someone you don't know or saying her tires were pointed away from him is dumb. Do you think that he could see where the tires were pointing when the SUV was hitting him? Do you think that when he was being hit he thought, hold on, let me check which way the tires are pointing? All he knew is that she was actively blocking traffic, refused to obey commands, heard her wife say drive baby drive while he was standing in front of the car to detain her, and then got hit. According to the law, a vehicle is a deadly weapon, and it doesn't matter how you intend to use it. If another person has a legitimate fear for their life, they can defend themselves. It doesn't help that the same agent had been dragged by a car just months before, but that just adds to the complexity and misfortune of the situation. When it comes to Alex Pretti, it didn't look great. It looks like a serious miscommunication between agents on the scene on the location and control of his gun. Now, the people blowing whistles 5 feet from them don't help their ability to communicate, but I wouldn't assume that the officer who fired was aware that he had just been disarmed, and had probably just heard that he had a gun. And proving that the agent did know that he had been disarmed is going to be tough, so people looking for some sort of prosecution are going to most likely be disappointed. Obviously an extremely unfortunate turn of events, but something can be legally justified while not being morally or descriptively pleasant. A split-second reaction in those situations have deadly consequences. To that, if there's one thing that all concealed carry classes harp on, is that as someone who carries, you should not be injecting yourself into potentially violent encounters, especially with law enforcement in general, let alone law enforcement that is much more highly strung due to constantly being attacked or harassed. That's a recipe for a disaster, and I don't blame Alex for carrying, or even carrying at a protest, but standing in the road and actively choosing to get into a potentially violent encounter with ICE, or law enforcement in general while armed, is a great way to get shot. And we know that he was willing to be confrontational with ICE because he had interacted aggressively before. Now, his past actions aren't relevant to the shooting, but it doesn't give credence to the idea that he was just a peaceful bystander. Carrying is a right, but it's also a responsibility to avoid conflict unless absolutely necessary, and you can't assume those around you can read your mind and understand your intentions. Both these also show how heavy resistance to ICE greatly increased the number of hostile interactions and led agents to be more on edge and short-fused. That's not a good thing, but how can anyone blame them? They're human, and getting things thrown at you, getting assaulted, and getting intimidated by large mobs is going to put anyone into a different level of readiness. If Minnesotans wanted ICE to be less aggressive, maybe they should have stuck to traditional methods of peaceful protesting instead of actively resisting law enforcement that is acting on perfectly lawful orders. And maybe the local authorities should have allowed the police department to help create a buffer and ease tensions. If Minnesotans have a problem with immigration enforcement, take it up with the courts, not the guys who are told where to go and who to go after. It's also bad when members of the administration immediately jumped to the conclusion that both of these people were domestic terrorists or wanted to commit mass murder, when there hadn't been any sort of investigation into the matter. There still hasn't been much time to investigate either situation, and it's not that hard to say. It's an unfortunate situation that I wish didn't happen, but it looks like law enforcement was justified in using lethal force. We'll have to wait for the investigation to play out before coming to major judgments. That's not hard, and you don't have to falsely demonize the person killed just because it created a massive controversy. That makes the entire thing look reckless, escalates the us versus them mentality, and just completely undercuts intellectual credibility. One more thing I would like to point out is Tim Walz's willingness to lie by omission the entire time when it comes to Minnesota's cooperation with federal law enforcement. Governor Walz has said that Minnesota has always fully complied with ICE detainers, and the reason that he is cleverly lying by omission is because at the state level, he's right. Minnesota's Department of Corrections must comply with ICE per state law, but what he isn't saying is that city and county jails do not. Jails like Hennepin County Jail, which is Minneapolis' county, specifically states that it does not comply with ICE due to sanctuary city policies, unless there is a judicial warrant, but those are tied to federal criminal prosecutions, and most crimes are prosecuted at the state level. So unless the illegal immigrant they're asking for has also committed some sort of federal crime, you're not likely to get a judicial warrant for that person. Hennepin County Jail doesn't even ask for immigration status per sanctuary policies, so an illegal immigrant could commit a crime, but so long as they do not receive more than 1 year of jail time, which is a requirement to be sent to state prison, they're never referred to federal authorities. So a plea deal or no contest that gets them lesser jail time, a fine, community service, or house arrest keeps them off of federal authorities' radar. All of this is really to say, if you don't like the law, then fortunately for you, we have ways to change it, mainly by voting. If elections don't go your way, that's probably because a lot of people disagree with you. Until then, you do have to follow the democratically implemented law, and authorities have an obligation to enforce it. And entering the country unlawfully does not have a statute of limitations, so saying that if you've managed to evade law enforcement for 10 years, you get a pass is pretty bad precedent, and gives a giant middle finger to the millions of people who have spent years and thousands of dollars to immigrate here the legal way. So people should never have blocked streets, thrown things at law enforcement, showed up at their hotels to intimidate them, or obstructed them. If people fought back through the legal process, all of these problems probably would have been avoided. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.